October 1941. The Russian plains tremble under the roar of German engines. Hundreds of Panzer tanks advance like a metallic swarm, spitting smoke and confidence. Ahead, the objective, Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was the final offensive, Operation Typhoon, the coup that would destroy the Red Empire and guarantee Germany's victory. In columns that snaked along the roads, Wehrmacht soldiers marched with firm steps, enveloped in dust and hope. Many believed the war would end before Christmas. They laughed, sang, and looked at maps with pride. They had conquered Kyiv, Smolensk, Minsk, and now Moscow seemed close, almost within reach. Just a few more weeks, they said, but the Russian sky was beginning to change. A cold wind blew from the east, and grey clouds covered the horizon like an omen. Autumn was arriving, and with it, the most treacherous enemy that man had ever faced, the Russian land itself. The roads, once firm, had become traps. The rains began to fall, mercilessly, transforming the ground into a sea of thick, sticky mud. Vehicles, loaded with ammunition and supplies, became bogged down up to their axles. Panzer tanks spun their tracks, useless, sinking like beasts trapped in quicksand. Soldiers tried to push trucks with their boots sinking up to their ankles. Every step was torment, every meter gained suffering. What was once the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was now becoming a war of attrition, of slowness and despair. The speed that had crushed Poland and France was dissolving into the Russian mud. The cold intensified. The light clothes, designed for the European spring, were no longer enough. Hands trembled, noses bled, lips cracked, and while the Germans fought against the terrain, the Soviets retreated but never gave up. They burned villages, destroyed bridges, and set fire to crops. Scorched earth, a brutal policy that left only ashes and hunger for the Isle. The nights grew long, and the noise of the engines was swallowed by the icy silence of the steppes. Some soldiers looked towards the horizon and felt something they had never known before. Fear. The fear that Moscow would never arrive. The fear that that immense land would swallow them up. And so, as the snow began to fall timidly, covering the mud with a thin white layer, the Wehrmacht took its first steps into a still, invisible cemetery. None of them knew, but that triumphant march was about to turn into a march to the white hell. October dragged on, and with it, the dream of a quick victory. What had previously been just rain had now become an endless flood, a whirlwind that battered the German columns day and night. The ground trembled under the weight of the tanks, but the saturated, waterlogged earth yielded beneath them. The mighty Panzer tanks, which had swept across Europe like thunderbolts of steel, they sank up to halfway down the conveyor belts, trapped, powerless, devoured by the mud. The soldiers, covered in mud up to their knees, pushed trucks with their bare, bloodied hands. The oil mixed with the mud formed a dark crust on their uniforms, and the cold began to rob them of their strength. Desperate horses neighed and collapsed from exhaustion, left behind in the ditches where the mud slowly swallowed them. The smell of death, oil, and decay was beginning to spread. The roads, once clearly marked on maps, had completely disappeared. Now, the Wehrmacht followed improvised trails, marked only by footprints and carcasses. Ammunition trucks overturned in ravines. Starving men pulled ropes to try and save the vehicles, only to see the weight drag them down with them, swallowed by a mud that seemed alive. And above all, the grey sky showed no mercy. The rain wouldn't stop. It was as if God himself had decided, wash the battlefield with suffering. The engines were cooling down. The radios were malfunctioning, and messages between units were being lost. Chaos reigned in each platoon. Inside the cold tank cabins, the air smelled of sweat and despair. The commander looked to the horizon and saw only mist and smoke. The turrets spun slowly, not searching for enemies, but trying to find a path that was still solid. Each kilometer seemed like an eternity. Meanwhile, the Soviets watched from afar. They knew the weather was working in their own ambition. The German boots now weighed twice as much. The metallic clang of the conveyor belts was replaced by a viscous, desperate sound. The sound of mud swallowing Germany's pride. What should have been a glorious march towards the Soviet capital turned into a slow, somber procession, as if each tank were advancing toward its own grave. And then, just when the soldiers thought things couldn't get any worse, the wind shifted, and the cold began to descend upon them like a death sentence. The Russian autumn had done its work. Now winter was approaching, and he wouldn't just bring cold weather, he would bring death. Don't just watch history, live it. Subscribe now. In Wehrmacht headquarters, maps still gleamed with advance lines. Red arrows pointed toward Moscow as if their destiny were simply a matter of time. Hitler demanded results. He had promised the German people that Moscow would fall before Christmas, and no general dared contradict him. But outside, on the roads covered in mud and ice, the reality was different. The soldiers, exhausted and hungry, marched in summer uniforms. Their boots were torn, their feet soaked, and their faces burned by the icy wind. Many wore pieces of Soviet blankets tied around their legs, trying to protect themselves from the cold that seeped into their bones. In the first days of October, there was still laughter in the camps. Some believed Moscow was only days away. "One more offensive, and we're finished," they said, lighting cigarettes with trembling hands. But the laughter soon faded. The flames wouldn't catch in the damp wind, and the cigarettes stuck to chapped lips. Faith began to freeze along with the skin. The supply trucks were increasingly delayed. Fuel was running low. The bread was as hard as a rock. Men divided a can of meat between 6. The motorized divisions that once sped like lightning now crawled along, trapped, in a land that seemed to suck every drop of energy away. Even so, orders continued to arrive from Berlin. Forward, Moscow is near. But the generals saw what Hitler did not. The army was at its limit. Engines were freezing, men were falling ill, and artillery was jamming. The Russian winter was approaching, an enemy that no tank could destroy. The confidence that once shone in the soldiers' eyes began to fade. The Blitzkrieg, the swift, brutal and decisive war, had transformed into a war of suffering and waiting. Each night seemed longer. The wind howled through the torn tents, and wolves howled in the forests. Some soldiers swore they heard voices in the wind, whispers in Russian calling them by name. They didn't know it yet, but that was the sound of the beginning of the end. The illusion of victory was crumbling, slowly and cruelly, under the weight of the ice forming on the ground. Germany believed it would capture Moscow before Christmas, but instead of bells, he would hear sound of bones cracking in the cold. The arrival of the cruelest winter of the century. Then he arrived, without warning, without mercy, without hope. The Russian winter descended upon the Wehrmacht like a fist of ice descending from the heavens. In just a few nights, the wind changed, and the world froze. The temperature suddenly dropped, plunging to 40 degrees. The air felt like a razor cut. The simple act of breathing caused lung pain. The soldiers' beards stiffened in minutes, covered in a crust of white ice. Their eyelids stuck together. Even sweat, once a symbol of effort, now turned into tiny, icy needles on their skin. The tank engines, accustomed to the European climate, stopped working. The oil turned to paste. The lubricants froze. The rifle barrels cracked when fired. Men tried to warm them with their bare hands, but the metal burned like reverse fire. The fire of the cold. The rations froze inside the cans. The bread, hard as a rock, had to be cut with bayonets. The simple act of eating became a battle, and the soldiers who tried to light fires saw the wind extinguish every spark, or the flames betray their positions to the Russians hidden in the forests. Night after night, bodies appeared in the trenches, motionless, rigid, frozen in silence. Some died in their sleep, others standing, still with their rifles in their hands. Wehrmacht soldiers were found like human statues covered in snow, eyes open, staring into nothingness. The cold didn't just kill, he sculpted death. In the makeshift shelters, despair spread. Men rubbed their hands until they bled. Others cut pieces of leather from their boots to put on their feet. The cold was a living force, an invisible enemy that whispered in their ears, "You're not going to survive." Meanwhile, the Soviets, accustomed to winter, emerged from the fog like ghosts. They wore heavy coats, skied, and moved quickly. Their snow-covered faces made them seem part of the landscape. And for the Germans, the entire landscape now seemed alive and hungry. The wind howled across the open plains, carrying with it the sounds of groans, stalled engines, and lost prayers. This was no longer a war of tanks or tactics. It was a war between man and nature itself. And in that battle, nature was winning. The Russian winter, the harshest of the century, had arrived. And with him, Hitler's army began to die, one soldier at a time. The invisible enemy, the cold. The cold, that enemy that no one could see, hear, or target, began to massacre the Wehrmacht with a cruelty that not even Soviet bullets could match. He infiltrated the tents, the bones, the thoughts. There was no escaping him. The sentinels guarding the positions were found in the morning, standing immobile, frozen. Their eyes were open, covered by a thin layer of ice. They continued to hold their rifles as if they were still on guard, but they had been dead for hours. Men who tried to sleep woke up with stiff fingers, unable to move. Those who fell asleep for a few minutes never woke up again. In the makeshift shelters, the air smelled of smoke and despair. Men huddled together trying to share body heat. Some wept silently. Others, delirious with fever, claimed to see their families in the flames of the bonfires, only to realize too late that the fire was consuming their clothes. The cold was maddening. It made the man crave any kind of pain, as long as it wasn't icy silence. The doctors didn't know what else to do. Gangrene, necrosis, finger. By finger, the cold stole away their extremities. Hands and feet were amputated with field knives without anesthesia. Screams echoed in the huts, muffled by the wind. Every night, dozens of bodies were dragged outside and piled up. There was no time to bury them. The earth was too hard, sealed by ice like an iron tomb. The summer uniforms were destroyed. Many soldiers wore Soviet clothing torn from the dead. Others wrapped rags around their arms, sheets stolen from burned villages. Anything to stay alive for another day. The cold also killed the tanks. The fuel froze inside the pipes, the gears seized, and the steel creaked as if screaming in pain. The machines that once symbolized German power were now frozen iron monuments, buried in the ice like defeated giants. And yet Hitler's orders were clear, not one step back. But how do you fight an enemy that doesn't bleed, doesn't sleep, and doesn't stop? Each gust of wind was a new offensive. Each night was a siege. Each breath a battle for survival. The cold was the true ruler of the steppes, and under its icy sway, the Wehrmacht began to disappear, not with explosions, but with silence. An absolute, white, and deadly silence. Men died without screaming, without falling. Just, they froze. And what remained was a silent landscape, covered in stiff bodies and snow, where even time seemed to have stopped. The Eastern Front, once a symbol of Hitler's glory, had become an invisible cemetery. The enemy wasn't wearing a red uniform. The enemy was winter itself. The Soviet counterattack dawn broke on December 5, 1941, over the icy expanses surrounding Moscow, a day that, at first glance, seemed like just another chapter in the endless saga of relentless cold, devouring hunger, and an oppressive silence that hung like a shroud over the front lines. German soldiers, huddled in makeshift trenches or sheltered in the ruins of burned villages, could hardly imagine that this would be the moment when the course of the war would irreversibly change. The air was heavy with an invisible tension, with snowflakes falling lazily, covering the minefields and the wreckage of previous battles. But suddenly, Hell erupted from the depths of the Russian earth, awakening with a fury that would echo through history. It all began with a subtle tremor in the frozen ground, as if the very earth's crust were rebelling against the invaders. Then, the horizon lit up with columns of black and orange smoke, rising like infernal pillars against the grey dawn sky. A deafening roar, a chorus of engines, screams and explosions filled the endless steppes, announcing the Soviet counterattack, a meticulously planned operation that would mobilize over 1 million soldiers, hundreds of tanks and artillery, that would shake the foundations of German strategy. This assault was no mere improvisation. It was the culmination of months of secret preparation, orchestrated by the Soviet High Command under the ruthless leadership of generals like Georgy Zhukov, who had been recalled from the Leningrad front to take command of the defense of Moscow. Zhukov, a man of iron forged in the Stalinist purges and the battles of the Russian Civil War, had reorganized the Soviet forces with brutal efficiency, incorporating Siberian reserves, troops hardened by the Arctic climate, accustomed to temperatures that would cause an ordinary man to succumb in minutes. From the midst of the frozen fog, which rose like a ghostly veil from the snowy forests and frozen rivers, emerged thousands of men of the Red Army, dressed in white camouflage coats that blended perfectly into the white landscape. They glided on long, lightweight skis, moving with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. These ski units, many from the remote regions of Siberia and the Soviet Far East, were composed of peasants, laborers, and even indigenous peoples, such as the Yakuts and Buryats, trained for operations in deep snow. They carried Mosin Nagant, rifles adapted for the cold, with special lubricants that wouldn't freeze, and grenades that would explode even in the lowest temperatures. Behind them, roaring like primordial beasts awakened from a millennial slumber, advanced the T-34 tanks, true marvels of Soviet engineering, designed by Mikhail Koshkin and mass-produced in factories evacuated to the Urals. These tanks, with their sloped armor that deflected enemy projectiles, robust diesel engines that ran flawlessly in winter, and wide tracks that distributed weight over soft snow, devoured the terrain with an ease that the German panzers envied. To the exhausted and demoralized Wehrmacht soldiers, these vehicles seemed like materialized ghosts from Slavic legends, emerging from the shadows to reclaim their ancestral land. Soviet artillery, positioned in camouflaged lines behind the pine forests, opened fire with devastating synchronicity. The sky was stained blood red as 115mm howitzers and 76mm cannons spat death upon German positions. But the true terror came from the Katyusha rockets, those multiple rocket launchers mounted on American Studebaker trucks supplied via Lend-Lease, which unleashed bursts of projectiles with a sharp, piercing scream, a sound the Germans nicknamed Stalin's organs, echoing for miles and instilling panic in the hearts of even the most hardened veterans. It was as if the very air was weeping in agony, a collective lament of the Russian souls massacred during the Nazi invasion. The frozen earth shattered into shards of ice and soil, hurling German soldiers into the air like rag dolls, their mutilated bodies falling into smoking craters. The explosions created clouds of snow and dust that obscured vision, turning the battlefield into primordial chaos. The German army, once an unstoppable war machine that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months, now found itself exhausted, ragged, and on the verge of collapse. Its panzer divisions, such as Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer and Erich Höppner's 4th Panzer, were reduced to fractions of their original strength, with soldiers suffering from dysentery, hunger, and untreated wounds. Without fuel, supplies had been cut off by Soviet partisans sabotaging railway lines and trains. Without sufficient ammunition, and almost without hope, many retreated in uncontrolled panic. Others, true to their oath of loyalty to Hitler, tried to fight to the end, firing their MG-42 machine guns jammed in the ice, shouting orders. in German that were lost in the howling wind. Chaos reigned on the front lines. Radio communications failed due to the freezing cold. Officers were killed at their command posts, and entire units dissolved in desperate escapes. In places like Klin and Solnechny-Gorsk, the Germans were flanked by coordinated Soviet attacks, forced to abandon valuable equipment, PaK-36 cannons, Opel Blitz trucks, and even prototype Panzer tanks, which would be captured and reused by the Soviets. The Russians, now under the leadership of Zhukov and others like Konstantin Rokossovsky, who had survived Stalinist prisons with torture marks on his teeth, advanced with brutal precision and a determination forged in collective suffering. They knew the enemy was weakened by the excessive extent of their supply lines, which stretched for over 1,000 kilometers from the Polish border. They also knew that winter was their most faithful ally, an invisible general fighting alongside them. Each village recaptured, like Istra with its Orthodox churches desecrated by the Nazis, or Volokolamsk, the scene of heroic previous defenses, was a cry for vengeance for the horrors of the invasion. Entire villages burned, civilians hanged in public squares, women and children massacred in acts of retaliation. Mother Russia, personified in Soviet propaganda as a protective maternal figure, was collecting its blood debt, with political commissars encouraging the troops with speeches about the Great Patriotic War and promises of eternal glory. The Germans tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The roads, once routes of rapid advance, were now buried under meters of snow, transformed into deadly traps. Vehicles became bogged down, horses succumbed to exhaustion, and communications were destroyed by Soviet air raids, Yak-1 and Il-2 Sturmovik planes, that, despite initial losses, now dominated the icy skies. And the cold, ever-present and cruel, intensified its grip, temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees or lower, winds freezing exposed flesh in minutes. Fleeing men were found frozen just meters from their makeshift camps, their bodies rigid as ice statues, their expressions of agony etched forever. Others, overcome by exhaustion and despair, simply lay down in the deep snow, covering themselves with torn blankets never to rise again, succumbing to hypothermia in a dreamless sleep. The Soviet counterattack was not merely a tactical military victory, it was a monumental historical turning point. The first major setback for the Third Reich on the Eastern Front. For the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Hitler's army was retreating en masse, abandoning positions that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The Wehrmacht, which had considered itself invincible after lightning victories in Western Europe, was now stumbling over its own dead, leaving behind piles of frozen bodies, immobilized tanks, and abandoned cannons, along with the illusory dream of conquering Moscow and subjugating the Soviet Union. This Soviet offensive, which would extend until April 1942, would recapture territories equivalent to the size of France, inflicting casualties on more than 500,000 German men and restoring the morale of the Soviet people, who saw in Zhukov a savior of the fatherland. And when night fell on that fateful day, the Germans, entrenched in precarious positions, looked to the horizon, merciless of all the adversaries the Wehrmacht had ever faced. It crept in slowly, with whistling winds that cut exposed skin like sharp blades, temperatures that plummeted abruptly to below 40 degrees and torn apart by the white vastness. Soldiers who once marched in impeccable uniforms, believing in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht under the command of generals like Fedor von Bock and Walter von Brauchitsch, now crawled through the deep snow, their faces blue with cyanosis, their eyes empty with despair, and their fingers necrotizing beneath torn and ill-fitting gloves. The uniforms, made for the mild European autumn, with fine wool coats and moisture-absorbing leather boots, were no match for the white inferno of Russia. The moisture froze inside the clothing, creating layers of ice that robbed body heat, leading to gangrene and makeshift amputations in overcrowded field hospitals. Many soldiers, coming from temperate regions of Germany such as Bavaria or the Rhineland, had never experienced such cold. They improvised with newspapers stuffed in their boots, animal skins looted from Russian farms, or even clothes stolen from dead Soviet prisoners. The supply trains, essential for sustaining a front of more than 1,500 kilometers, had come to a complete standstill. The railway lines, with gauges different from the Soviet ones, required time-consuming conversions, and the partisans, Soviet guerrillas organized in gangs like those of Sidor, Kovpak sabotaged tracks, bridges and depots with homemade explosives isolating the German troops. Food arrived frozen before it could even be distributed. Cans of preserved meat turned into solid blocks. Bread hardened like stone and had to be cut with bayonets or axes, while hot soups froze in the plates in minutes. A German soldier, in an improvised diary and a torn notebook, recorded the torment. "We are no longer fighting against the Russians. We are fighting against the cold, which devours us from the inside out, stealing our strength and our will." The daily ration, already meager, was supplemented with meat from slaughtered horses, animals that died standing, frozen in grotesque positions, their bodies serving as fuel for pathetic fires that barely provided warmth. The roads, once swift advance routes, disappeared under endless layers of ice and snow, transforming into deadly labyrinths. Horses, vital for transporting artillery in a Wehrmacht that relied more on animal traction than motorized vehicles, succumbed to exhaustion and cold, dropping dead by the thousands and being devoured by starving troops. Abandoned tanks dotted the steppes like silent iron monuments covered in snow, useless without fuel or spare parts. Many Panzer IVs were bogged down in frozen mud, their engines failing for lack of adequate antifreeze. At night, the cold became a serial killer. Sentries fell asleep from exhaustion and never woke up again, their bodies found stiff at dawn, frost covering their open eyes. Diseases like typhus and pneumonia raged in the overcrowded camps, where soldiers huddled together in makeshift wooden huts or holes dug in the snow, sharing lice and despair. And on the other side of the front line, the enemy, the Red Army, watched with predatory patience, waiting for the right moment to attack. Their troops, equipped with valenki, warm felt boots, ushankas, fur hats, and white camouflage, were adapted to the climate. They built underground shelters called zemlyanki, heated by wood-burning stoves, and received supplies via shorter internal routes. Moscow was there, less than 100 kilometers from the German advanced positions, so close that, on clear days, binoculars could spot the Kremlin towers, but to the invaders it seemed like another planet, unreachable across the white abyss. The dream of conquest, fueled by Hitler's arrogance in ignoring his general's warnings about the Russian winter, was beginning to freeze to death in the vastness of the Russian steppes. Orders from Berlin forbade retreats, forcing troops to hold suicidal positions, while Hitler, in his bunker in East Prussia, dismissed commanders like Guderian for defeatism. Thousands perished not in battle, but in the silent death of the ice, bodies frozen in ditches, units decimated by exposure, and morale evaporating like smoke in the Arctic wind. This winter not only paralyzed the German advance, it sowed the seeds of total defeat, transforming Operation Typhoon into a frozen nightmare that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and alter the balance of World War II. The silence of the dead in the ice. The wind cut like razor-sharp glass, howling across the vast, desolate steppes, carrying snowflakes that pricked exposed skin like invisible needles. Each gust made the soldiers instinctively flinch, clutching their frozen, stiffened coats, which served no purpose other than as a cruel reminder of their equipments. inadequacy for the harsh Russian winter. The thermometer, when it still functioned, had plummeted well below zero, frequently reaching 35 Plavstic or lower, temperatures that turned the air into a lethal enemy, freezing the oil in Mauser rifles until the weapons became useless, and causing the Panzer tank tracks to crack like dry ice under the weight and relentless cold. And the men became pale shadows, wandering through an infinite white immensity, their silhouettes blurred against the grey horizon, where sky and earth merged into an oppressive whiteness that swallowed any notion of direction or hope. Those who were still breathing looked like zombies from an apocalyptic nightmare, dragging their feet across the hardened snow that crunched beneath their worn boots, leaving jagged trails that were soon erased by new layers of ice. Their faces were swollen from prolonged exposure, their lips cracked and black with cold, bleeding with every attempt to speak or eat. Their nostrils burned as they inhaled the frigid air, which penetrated their lungs like frozen fire, causing dry, painful coughs that faintly echoed in the void. Many could no longer feel their hands or feet, amputated by the cold before they even realized it, gangrene silently setting in, turning fingers into useless black stumps that had to be cut off with makeshift knives in the overcrowded field hospitals, where exhausted surgeons operated by the light of flickering lanterns. The horses, which had once pulled par cannons and essential supplies in a Wehrmacht that still relied heavily on animal traction, lay dead on the frozen road, their bodies stiff in grotesque positions. Hooves raised as if still marching, glazed eyes staring blankly into nothingness, like statues sculpted by the very hell of the Russian climate, now serving only as desperate food for starving troops who cut chunks of frozen meat with bayonets. The sound of the engines had completely disappeared, replaced by a sepulchral silence broken only by the muffled groans of the wounded and the occasional cracking of bones under the compacted snow, or by the crackling of pathetic campfires fueled with damp wood and animal carcasses. At night, the cold reached an unimaginable peak of cruelty, descending to levels where the simple act of sleeping was a risk of certain death. Many soldiers, exhausted after days of forced marching, lay down in holes dug in the snow or in torn tents and never woke up again, succumbing to hypothermia in an eternal sleep that their comrades discovered at dawn, their bodies hardened like petrified wood. The companions, hardened by survival, upon realizing death was upon them, would simply pull the body aside with hooks or numb hands, covering it with snow to mask the smell of decomposition, and continue to watch the nothingness, the absolute void, the infinite darkness that stretched as far as the eye could see, punctuated only by the distant silhouettes of burned villages or skeletal forests. What was once the mighty army that had crushed Europe with lightning victories, conquering Poland in mere weeks, overthrowing France in a sunny May, and advancing through Scandinavia and the Balkans with terrifying efficiency, now marched like a caravan of lost souls, a procession of ghosts dragging themselves across the white expanse. The faces, once marked by the Aryan pride propagated by the regime, no longer showed unwavering faith or fanatical determination. Instead, they displayed a blank, distant and haunted gaze that seemed to silently ask, "Why? Why has this madness brought us here, to die at the end of the world?" Officers, like those in panzer divisions led by men such as Hermann Hoth or Erich von Manstein, tried to maintain discipline with shouted orders, but their voices were swallowed by the wind, and many soldiers deserted in small groups, only to perish alone on the steppes, frozen in fetal positions of despair. Meanwhile, the Soviets, in their white coats and camouflage of felt and fur, became an integral part of the hostile landscape, invisible among the deep snow and rolling hills, blending into the environment like silent predators adapted to centuries of harsh winters. Partisan units, composed of local civilians, peasants and scattered soldiers, hunted the Germans with precise ambushes, cutting supply lines and eliminating isolated sentries with knives or silenced rifles. Every step taken by the invaders was an imminent death. Sentence: with improvised mines hidden under the snow or snipers positioned in frozen trees, firing with deadly accuracy. Moscow was still distant, only dozens of kilometers away for some advanced regiments, but hell had already truly begun. A hell of deadly silence, where death came not with the roar of battles, but with the icy whisper of the wind, reaping lives one by one in the merciless vastness. This period of stagnation, between November and December 1941, marked the nadir of Operation Typhoon, with hundreds of thousands of German casualties not from combat, but from exposure, hunger and disease, preparing the ground for the Soviet counterattack that would come like an inevitable storm. Would you like me to move on to the next topic? The moment when the Soviets launched their winter counteroffensive. The winter counteroffensive, the counterattack of ice and blood. Suddenly, the impossible happened, breaking the deadly monotony of winter like thunder in a clear sky. On the white, silent horizon, which until then had only echoed the lament of the wind, the roar of hundreds of engines burst through the icy air with primal fury, announcing the awakening of a besieged nation. It wasn't the German tanks, bogged down and inert in the snow. It was the Soviet T-34s, emerging like steel monsters covered in fresh snow, spitting fire and black smoke from their 76mm cannons, advancing with a determination that defied the murderous cold. The Russian counteroffensive had begun, a colossal operation orchestrated by the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, which would mobilize fresh reserves of over 1 million men, including Arctic-hardened Siberian divisions, to push the invaders back from the gates of Moscow. It was December 1941, specifically the 5th, when Soviet forces launched their simultaneous offensive on multiple fronts, taking advantage of the peak of winter that had paralyzed the enemy. The cold was punishing with an almost supernatural fury, with blizzards that reduced visibility to meters and temperatures that froze anything exposed, but the men of the Red Army advanced with a force that seemed to come from the frozen earth itself, fueled by a fierce patriotism instilled by Stalinist propaganda and hatred for the occupiers who had devastated their lands. They knew what was at stake, their homes burned in villages like Vyazma, their families executed in massacres like Babi Yar, their homeland threatened with extinction by the Nazi ideology of Lebensraum. Dressed in white camouflage cloaks, fur Ushanka hats, and Valenki boots that insulated against the ice, they moved like ethereal ghosts, attacking from all sides, flanking weakened German positions, infiltrating dense forests, and crossing frozen rivers with an agility that the invaders, trapped in inadequate uniforms, could not match. The Germans, exhausted after months of continuous advance that had taken them more than 800 kilometers from the border, could barely react, their units reduced by half due to casualties and the cold. The T-34s cut through the snow with impressive ease, their wide, angled tracks distributing weight to avoid sinking in the white depth, and their diesel engines adapted to the cold with special fuel mixtures that wouldn't freeze. Roared like hungry beasts awakened from a long fast, advancing at speeds that the German Panzer IIIs, with their gasoline engines susceptible to freezing, envied. Behind them came squadrons of Soviet infantry, composed of recruits from all the republics of the Union, Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and even Mongols, shouting "Hurrah!" with a collective force that chilled the blood of those who heard it, an ancestral cry that echoed from the battles against the Tatars and the Poles, now revived to expel the fascists. Tracer bullets sliced through the air like red sparks amidst the absolute white, illuminating the chaos with luminous trails that guided the night attacks, while mortars and Katyusha Rockets launched volleys of rockets that filled the sky with a sharp wail, exploding in cascades of fire over German trenches. German soldiers desperately tried to resist, digging defensive positions with frozen shovels and firing MG-34 machine guns that frequently jammed due to the accumulated ice. But they were weak, frozen to the bone, and starved of supplies that never arrived, thanks to interruptions caused by partisans dynamiting bridges and railway tracks. Weapons jammed at critical moments, radios didn't work due to batteries drained by the cold, and vehicles from Opel trucks to CKFZ half-tracks lay dead in the ice, abandoned like empty hulls. Many tried to flee, running in panic through minefields or blocked roads. But where to? The cold and the enemy surrounded them on all sides, with Soviet forces like Rokossovsky's 16th Army and Govorov's 5th Army closing in on isolated groups, turning the retreat into a chaotic series of ambushes and hand-to-hand combat. It was the beginning of a slow, drawn-out and merciless massacre, where casualties piled up not only from bullets, but from utter exhaustion, with men collapsing in the snow, never to rise again. The white ground was soon stained red, with blood dripping and freezing instantly, mingling with the snow, as if the earth were alive and thirsty, devouring the bodies of the fallen in a macabre symbiosis of ice and death. The Soviets advanced step by step, pushing the enemy back with coordinated attacks that recaptured strategic hills and villages like Krasnaya Polyana, each meter paid for with lives on both sides, but they did not stop, driven by Stalin's orders not to retreat an inch, and by the sight of Moscow, the sacred capital, safe behind them. Moscow would not fall. This certainty became palpable as German forces, such as Army Group Center under von Bock, were forced to cede ground, abandoning valuable equipment that would be captured and reused by the Soviets. And then, like a wounded beast, roaring in agony, the German army began to retreat en masse, a disorderly retreat that marked the end of the illusion of invincibility. The Blitzkrieg that had shocked the world with its speed and precision now crumbled under the snow, consumed by the relentless cold and the implacable resistance of a people who refused to die, transforming the offensive into a desperate defense that would stretch for months, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and altering the course of the war forever. The chaotic retreat, death at every step, January 1942. What remained of the once invincible Army Group Center, more than 1 million men reduced to less than half, torn apart by combat, hunger and winter, began to retreat, or rather, to attempt to retreat, for the very idea of orderly movement had become a cruel illusion. But how could they flee when the very ground was the enemy, a living trap of deep snow that reached knees, thighs and even waist in treacherous stretches, sucking boots? And strength with equal veracity. The wind cut their faces like invisible razors, carrying ice crystals that scratched skin already burned by the cold, leaving bloody furrows that froze before they could even heal. The tanks, which had been the pride of the Blitzkrieg, Panzer III with 50mm guns, Panzer IV with reinforced armor, were now frozen carcasses abandoned one by one along the ghost roads, their engines petrified from lack of fuel or proper oil, their turrets locked forever pointing east like silent monuments to past arrogance. The men staggered like specters from a medieval nightmare, dragging themselves in jagged columns that stretched for miles across the white steppes. Their faces, once marked by Prussian discipline and faith in the Führer, were burned by the icy wind, their skin cracked and swollen, their lips split and bleeding frozen pus, their eyes empty of any hope other than surviving another day. Some crawled on all fours when their legs failed, using rifles as makeshift crutches. Others were carried by comrades on stretchers made from doors torn from burned isbas, or on sleds pulled by dying horses, and many simply fell, one knee buckling, then the whole body, and the army pressed on, trampling over its own dead without ceremony, for to stop meant to die. The triumphal march of the Blitzkrieg, which had crossed Poland in 27 days and France in 42, had turned into a procession of ghosts, a frozen Via Crucis, where each step was a silent prayer for salvation that would not come. The ranks crumbled like snow in the weak winter sun. The meticulous organization that had once been the pride of Germany, with radio-coordinated Panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and Luftwaffe air support, disappearing under the crushing weight of collective despair. Command shouted orders through makeshift megaphones or hoarse voices. Officers like those of Hans von Funk's 7th Panzer Division or Hermann Balck's 11th Panzer Division attempting to impose discipline with threats of court-martial, but no one listened anymore. The roar of the Siberian winds and the constant crunching of ice under boots swallowed all voices, turning orders into inaudible whispers. Units were mixed up in confusion. Infantry regiments from the 258th Division accidentally merged with remnants of the 3rd Motorized Division. Soldiers lost their platoons in the blizzard and wandered alone until they froze, while junior officers assumed improvised commands, only to be shot. For defeatism, if they hesitated, the enemy offered no respite, even in the apparent calm of the retreat. The Red Army, now relentless and reinvigorated by Siberian reserves like the 1st Shock Army and the 20th Army, hunted down the stragglers like hungry wolves in a pack, coordinated by Zhukov and his subordinates. Soviet squads, composed of camouflage skiers, local partisans armed with PPSH-41s, and even Cossack cavalry revived for the snowy terrain, ambushed German columns in abandoned villages like Mozhaisk or Ruza, emerging from the fog like apparitions and mowing down exhausted soldiers who could barely lift their frozen weapons. In a typical ambush near Volokolamsk, a German company of the 78th Assault Division was surrounded in a burning farmhouse. Its men surrendered and summarily executed against burnt wooden walls, their bodies left as a warning. The snow, once immaculate and white as a pure shroud, was now red in irregular patches, an endless cemetery where fresh blood froze into dark crusts, mingling with the feces of dead horses and oil spilled from abandoned vehicles. The frozen bodies lay upright for hours or days, sustained by rigor mortis amplified by the extreme cold, as if still marching in ghostly formation. A sentry with his rifle slung over his shoulder, a gunner bent over a useless PaK-38 cannon, his open eyes staring into the eternal void. At certain choke points, such as narrow passages through forests or blown-up bridges, the Germans had to push these corpses to clear a path, using bayonets or numb hands to knock down the rigid comrades, who fell with a hollow sound like broken wood. An officer of the 10th Panzer Division, in a report scribbled on a torn piece of paper, wrote in trembling handwriting, "We did not retreat. We only died westward, leaving a trail of ourselves for the enemy to count their victories." These diaries, later found in frozen pockets, revealed the psychological collapse. Men questioning the war, cursing, Hitler in whispers, or simply recording the number of steps to their next fatal resting place. The radios, when they still ran on batteries heated over campfires, transmitted messages of pure despair that echoed in distant headquarters in East Prussia. No fuel for the last trucks, no ammunition except a few grenades, no men, just shadows. Command posts like Kluge's in Zhukov received reports of entire divisions evaporated, with casualty rates of 70% or more. Hitler's dream, the lightning, attack that would destroy the Soviet Union in a few months as promised in June 1941, was now buried under meters of snow, along with thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of rifles, and the pride of a nation that saw itself as mistress of Europe. Orders from Berlin forbade general retreats, forcing isolated hedgehog positions that were surrounded and annihilated one by one, turning the retreat into a series of localized massacres. And as the sun disappeared on the icy horizon, tinging the snow a bloody orange that lasted only minutes before total darkness, the last survivors understood the bitter truth with painful clarity. They were not merely retreating from Moscow, just 30 kilometers away, in some advanced positions. They were fleeing the very hell they had summoned, a realm of ice, where death came not with glory, but with the silence of a body that ceases to tremble. This chaotic retreat, which would extend until March 1942, would cost the Germans more than 300,000 additional casualties, stabilizing the front only at Rzhev and Vyazma, but planting the seeds for greater defeats at Stalingrad and beyond. The ice cemetery, the end of Operation Typhoon. The silence after the defeat was almost deafening, an absolute void that followed the chaos like the calm after an apocalyptic storm. The Russian steppes, once shaken by the deafening roar of the Maybach engines of German tanks, the deafening rumble of 88mm cannons, and the constant crackling of machine guns in combat in the suburbs of Moscow, now lay covered by a deadly calm that seemed to mock the previous fury. But this calm concealed an indescribable horror, a landscape of desolation that transformed the white vastness into an open-air mausoleum, where death reigned supreme without the need for epitaphs. For miles and miles along the Moscow-Smolensk highway and the secondary trails that cut through frozen birch forests, what could be seen were frozen shadows, entire rows of dead soldiers fallen in their final positions, transformed into ice statues by the hypothermia that had claimed them during the night or in ambushes. M35 helmets covered in thick layers of snow. Of the Wehrmacht were surrounded and annihilated. The Russians, accustomed to the cold, moved with speed and precision, while the Germans, trembling, stumbled on the ice, firing blindly. Winter had switched sides. It was now Soviet. The snow, which had previously slowed the German advance, now concealed the footsteps of those who came to kill them. The white hell, which the Nazis thought they had conquered, now swallowed them mercilessly. Hitler's Blitzkrieg had turned into a frozen nightmare, and every meter reclaimed by the Russians was watered with blood, sweat, and tears, a reminder that Russia never bows down. It just waits for winter to come. The final withdrawal, the collapse of the survivors, February 1942. What remained of the German army was no longer an army. It was a trail of corpses and broken souls trying to escape the frozen hell. The order to retreat was given, but the retreat was not a maneuver. It was collective despair. The soldiers, who months before had marched triumphantly through Ukraine and Belarus, now dragged themselves back, covered in rags, their faces burned by the wind and their eyes dull and lifeless. Many didn't even know where they were. They marched because their bodies still moved, by instinct, not by will. The roads were covered in ice and corpses, broken trucks, abandoned cannons, fallen horses. In some stretches, survivors used frozen bodies as steps to cross ditches, filled with snow and blood. Each step was a struggle against the cold and against time. The Red Army left no one to escape. The winter hunters in their white cloaks pursued the German columns like hungry wolves. With each ambush, more men fell. Those who were captured rarely survived captivity. The cold did the work that bullets couldn't. Communications were cut off. Officers were desperate, trying to maintain some order, but discipline had died in the snow along with hope. Many soldiers shot themselves in the feet to be evacuated. Others, delirious with fever and hunger, saw mirages of bonfires and walked straight to their deaths. The Wehrmacht, once synonymous with power and precision, now crawled across the frozen ground like a shadow of its former self. On every hill, in every snow-covered forest, lay a piece of Hitler's arrogance, frozen and broken. And when, at last, the survivors crossed the Dnieper, leaving the battlefield behind, they gazed silently eastward. None of them uttered a word. They knew they were leaving behind not only their dead, but also the dream of conquering Russia. Operation Typhoon had ended, and the price paid was the highest possible. Thousands of men buried beneath the eternal ice of the steppes. The meaning of the ice cemetery, the day the Blitzkrieg died. When the cold finally subsided and the snow began to melt, the true extent of the horror came to light. Those white plains where marches and cries of victory had once echoed, now revealed a sea of frozen bodies, destroyed vehicles, and twisted weapons. The wind howled through the remains of the German divisions, as if lamenting the dead or mocking the living. The once invincible Wehrmacht was broken. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning bolt that had devastated Europe, had been extinguished by the Russian winter. What remained were frozen faces, open eyes staring into the void, and uniforms covered in ice. Men who believed they were marching to glory, but found only oblivion. The Soviets called that camp the Ice Cemetery. For them, it wasn't just the place where the enemy perished. It was a symbol of resistance, of the strength of a people who preferred death to surrender. Every spring, when the ice melted and the bodies returned to the surface, villagers would make the sign of the cross and say, "Here lies the pride of Germany." In German cities, news of the defeat arrived muffled, shrouded in censorship. But the families knew. Letters stopped arriving. Silences became answers. Mothers and wives looked eastward with fear, and they knew their children were there, frozen somewhere lost in the Russian steppes. The dream of conquering Moscow had died, and with it, the illusion that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union with speed and arrogance. What Hitler called Blitzkrieg now had a new name among the survivors: the March to White Hell. The war would continue, yes, but it would never be the same. That icy cemetery would be a harbinger of what was yet to come. Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, and for those who survived, the Russian cold would never leave them. It had become a part of them, an eternal ghost whispering in the dark. Here, Germany began to die.